What's up, Psychedelic Spotlight podcast? Boy, do we have a treat for you today, and that is because I am here interviewing one of my psychedelics heroes, Dr. Matthew Johnson. Now, I know that for most of you guys, most of you watching this podcast, you don't need an introduction, but I'm going to give you one anyhow. Dr. Matthew Johnson is a man of many talents. He is a professor at Johns Hopkins University. He's one of the leading voices and scientists in the psychedelics world. His work on tobacco addiction using psilocybin is one of the real foundational documents of the psychedelic space. And as I learned today, he is also a comedian. I watched a conference he gave today and he had the crowd roaring in laughter. But on top of all of those things, I think the thing that sets Dr. Johnson apart is I view him more as a philosopher than anything else. His ability to think deeply about the subject in a variety of podcasts and really cut through all of the noise and get to the issue, the deep-rooted issues, is really impressive. So I am so excited. Dr. Johnson, thank you so
James.
much for doing this.
Call me Matt.
Pleasure. I will call you Matt. Alrighty, so I guess let's start with your research. Can you tell us a little bit about what you're doing at Johns Hopkins using treating smoking cessation with psilocybin and any other projects you're working on?
Yeah, so conducted a lot of research at Hopkins over the last 17 years with psilocybin and healthy normals, looking at mystical experience and personality change, meditation, religious professionals, therapeutically with cancer distress and depression. But the smoking cessation is what I talked about today, and that's really a real baby of mine, going back to 13 years or so, when I cooked up the idea and, wrote a protocol.
How did you come up with the idea?
So I had been, there was this signal based on the early work in the 60s, and also just anecdotes if you listen to people, of addiction recovery across different substances. Alcohol, cocaine, opioids, etc. I mean, there's these stories across a bunch of different substances, and so I was very interested to see whether smoking would fit into that category. I had a lot of research experience. Even in those early days, I'd been doing smoking research for years, going back to my earliest days in graduate school. And so it was an area that I was already steeped in terms of understanding that form of addiction and understanding its treatments. And it was also a very interesting question. Like something I struggled over was, do psychedelics only help people with drugs that typically associate with sort of a rock bottom effect?
Mm-hmm.
Like I remember the commercials when I was like in the early 80s as a kid.
Your
the guy
brain on drugs.
Well, that, but I'm actually thinking of one. It's gotten less notoriety. The guy's on the floor of the public bathroom. He spills his cocaine. He's trying to scrape it up on the tile with the dried up urine and everything. So it's like, do you have to hit rock bottom with hardcore alcoholism or you name it, cocaine, heroin, or does a drug like tobacco that typically isn't associated with so-called rock bottom effects, can you address that addiction? I mean, typically no one's spouse has left them because of their smokes. Typically they haven't ruined their career. They're not alienated from their children because of smoking. There's exceptions, but it's an addiction. In terms of killing people, it kills far more than any other addiction. And so, there's this real scientific curiosity. Can it help with this form of addiction? It clearly is addiction.
Can it? Let's get to some of the results.
The data suggests it's still early days, but it looked really promising. In our pilot study, we had an 80% biologically verified success rate 6 months after they quit smoking with psilocybin.
80%?
80%, that's 12 out of 15.
Does anything else come even close to that?
Nothing in the scientific literature had ever come close to that. The caveat is it was a non-randomized, open-label pilot study, so we could have gotten lucky. It could have been something besides the psilocybin.
But you're attempting to repeat it right now.
Right. So those promising data really just told us, hey, it was safe and looked promising. Is it worthy of follow-up? Abso-freaking-lutely. Was able to hustle up the funding for additional research thanks to the Hefter Research Institute, particularly Cody Swift. Was able to move into a larger randomized study, which we're mostly through with now, and right now at the year-long follow-up, 59% of people from a single psilocybin session at 1 year are biologically verified smoke-free with psilocybin compared to 28% with nicotine patch. Those results could change because that study's in progress.
This kind of seems like a game changer to me. Like hearing you throw out these numbers, it seems like we're on the verge of helping a lot of people that want to be helped, but up until this point haven't really had the opportunity to.
Right, and all of these people I've mentioned in these studies have been treatment resistant. In other words, they've tried multiple other things. Yeah, they've tried other things and they're still smoking. And so, yeah, again, you want to, as a scientist, ride that, find that Goldilocks between, like, I need to really emphasize, like, this seems to be paradigm shifting. It seems to be really big in mental health treatment, including addiction, including smoking. But it's nothing's going to work for everyone. We have to follow the data. We have to, there's going to be people that it doesn't work for. We have to understand more about it, but it's still really promising.
And as a scientist, you have to be careful with your words. You have to couch everything in sort of like give disclaimers and everything.
Yeah.
You can't come close to the big C word, the cure word, at all. But do you think that this could be a quote-unquote cure?
I'll say this, for some people, it looks more like a cure.
Okay.
And that's like much like what, of course, the great work that MAPS has done with MDMA and PTSD. Same thing there. Same thing with, certainly in the work we did with cancer patients. In a lot of these cases, a lot of individual cases look so much like cures because with these different disorders, it really seems that people have gotten to the psychological roots of those disorders. You're not just treating surface symptoms. And once it's resolved, you have an escape velocity there.
So I'm so happy you brought up the MAPS trial, because in talking about a cure here, I believe the language that they use, they're using MDMA to try to treat PTSD in individuals, and they found that 68% of people, the language is something along the lines of improved so much that they no longer considered to have the diagnosis of PTSD. And that seems like they're trying
Sounds
to
like cure.
It sounds like cure.
Sounds more cautious, doesn't it? Yep.
So I'm going to pivot gears here for a second because I want to talk about the drug that I find most interesting in this space. And it's actually, in learning about this drug is what got me interested in the psychedelic space in the first place, and that is DMT. So for any people that are familiar with what the subjective feelings of a DMT trip is like, when you take a high enough dose, you appear to enter some sort of other realm where maybe there's autonomous beings that are perhaps interacting with you. So I guess my question for you is, what the hell is happening there? Is this just something that's happening in the brain that can be explained using neurochemistry, or could there perhaps be something larger at play here, something spiritual, something else? You're the scientist.
I like this question, James. And the best questions are the ones where you're not going to get a good answer from me, because it's like, I wish we had the data. But I'll say this, and I've looked into this quite a bit. We did some survey work with DMT, with these experiences of the other, of the alien, of the angels, of the self-dribbling basketballs, whatever you want to call them, these autonomous, the perception of these entities. We can't, and the same general caveat applies to people having an experience that they might interpret as an experience of God or any sort of religious or spiritual belief. The science is really cannot speak to the ultimate ontological reality or lack thereof of those experiences. We can study phenomenology, meaning we can study the experience, what people say about the experience, but we ultimately can't say whether that entity is real or not. We can't say it's not real. I mean, I don't have any evidence that it's real, but I can't, if someone believes it's real, I don't have any evidence to convince them that it's not real. Same as an experience of God. So I think that's particularly important in doing science in this area, that it's fascinating to study people's reactions to these big picture questions, like, are you visiting other dimensions? Is this the realm of God? Are these the other dimensions the physicists talk about? Who knows? They're fun speculations, but we have to be very cautious of what our empirical science can speak to and what it can't. And it's totally appropriate to understand people's experiences, what they say about them, but you got to be very careful. And sometimes I get on colleagues about the language, like we have to be very cautious about this is not an endorsement of the reality, or we're also not refuting the reality of these experiences.
Well, the thing that I find particularly interesting about DMT experiences is how similar people's stories seem to be. If you and I both take a bag of mushrooms, we might have a completely different experience. But when you listen to a lot of DMT stories, there's often, on a low dose, the sensation that the reality is realer than real. If you take a little bit more, you enter a tunnel. If you take a little bit more, you enter another dimension where there are, and they're described differently. Different cultures describe the experience differently, but there seems to be some sort of congruence there of entering another space and interacting with beings. And I personally just find the fact that so many people have the same experience as opposed to a bunch of different random experiences very interesting.
Although it's a difficult experiment to run, the cultural contamination. I will note that, a number of people seem to have, I mentioned self-dribbling basketballs, which of course is the classic Terence McKenna experience. I think if you've listened to dozens of hours or hundreds of hours of Terence McKenna on YouTube, like I have and so many folks have,
he's not the most conservative with his language.
What? No, and he wasn't trying to be. Yes. But if that's the account that you've been exposed to, that can potentially shape your experience. So it's no surprise that if you've heard Terence talk about his experience, that you might end up having self-dribbling basketball. So it's very hard to tease out, or self-transforming machine elves is the other way he puts it, which I love these phrases. So I don't know, like with ayahuasca, which of course contains DMT and it's taken orally, a classic is like an experience of a jaguar and that type of thing. So I'm frankly more skeptical of the commonality, like that those are anything more than cultural artifacts. I'll say I can't definitively say that it's anything more than that. It could be. Some of the things, like a sense of entering the tunnel, to me that gets a little more likely that there is a commonality, like you're probably pushing the right buttons for having a certain like spatial, localization of a sense of self in time and space, that maybe that is related. I mean, that is a very common experiences. And just the fact that people are experiencing entities, I think to me that speaks to something probably common, that you're somehow pushing the buttons associated with that sense of self and other, at a very fundamental biological level. The nature of the other, though, whether it's an alien, whether it's an elf, whether it's an angel, whether it's a machine elf, that's probably culturally painted.
I want to believe. Like I
we got Mulder over here.
Exactly. So one last question.
Am I playing Scully?
Perhaps. I'm going to be honest. I don't even know what we're referencing right now. I'm sorry.
The X-Files. Come
X-Files.
on.
Okay, my bad. So one last question on DMT and also a little bit of LSD, I guess, in here. I want to know if you've ever attempted to look into any of the kind of black ops studies that say the CIA or other groups did using these type of drugs for maybe telepathy or maybe whatever they were doing, if you've looked into it to see what the results were. Because we often hear like the CIA used LSD to try to promote like telepathy or whatever, but we never hear if they discovered anything,
There was a lot of this research, and there was a whole range. I mean, the most unethical stuff was done by the CIA, and for interested folks, like Lee and Schlein's Acid Dreams is really the definitive account, based on a great book based on declassified documents from the Freedom of Information Act. But there was also work that went on by the Army, which in the scheme of things was, way more ethical than what the CIA. I mean, CIA was doing something like dosing people visiting a sex worker without their knowledge to see.
Dosing the sex workers, the people in there, and even the CIA agents watching it were all being
their fellow CIA agents sometimes. And so it was obviously some highly unethical stuff, but some of the stuff that the Army was doing, not necessarily so unethical.
Okay.
But nonetheless, the overall context, trying to look at these things as interrogation agents or incapacitating agents. But a part of that work, and I don't recall whether this was more the Army or the CIA, but there was that work, and I can't really cite you the details. I don't know how many details. I think probably the most extensive I read about that might be from acid dreams. Also some work in the psi, in the psi area. I'm thinking of some of the books by Dean Radin, I think, has written about that history of, claims of remote viewing. The folks that could see a nuclear submarine being built up in Siberia.
That stuff is wild.
So I don't know. It's hard to, it's interesting that this was being looked at very serious levels. But I don't think we have published data that are, anywhere close to definitive on that type of thing.
Okay, so I got a softball question for you.
I love softball.
What is consciousness?
Oh man, you tricked. Dude, they call it the hard problem for a reason. Yeah. So I recently wrote a commentary. One of my big takeaways: we just need more precise language when we say consciousness.
Okay.
Kind of the biggest C, is phenomenal consciousness. That is just addressing, and this is the source of the so-called hard problem with David Chalmers.
You want to just quickly describe what the hard problem is?
Yeah, and Chalmers put that name on it, the hard problem, but it had been written about by numerous people, Nagel, and then going back, deeper into history. Why is there experience, period? Mm-hmm. Why is there any subjectivity versus not? What is it
you're
like?
Gonna answer that.
Right, yeah. You'll notice I'll talk a lot and won't give you any answer like a politician. What is it like to be, Nagel described it, what is it like to be something? Presumably there's an experience of a bat, or of my dog, or of you. I don't have any direct experience that you're having an experience, no evidence that you're having an experience, but it really seems like I'm having an experience, and you seem like another human like me, so it's kind of a good presumption, but Probably. It is a presumption that you're having an experience.
Maybe you're the only person on the planet, and we're all NPCs.
Right. This may be the only experience that's ever been as the one, and I don't have, and that's the hard problem. Yeah. It seems that there's no possibility of empirical testing of the nature, or even proving that there is subjective experience outside of our own felt sense of subjective experience. So that's the hard problem. There are others. So I'm not holding my breath for psychedelics to solve that problem. And as far as I know, there's no credible even ideas on how to leverage psychedelics to use that. That said, I'm very open and I'm hopeful, but I'm not holding my breath. Other things that are called consciousness, such as, which are well short of the hard problem, but what is the nature of self-representation or of having a sense of self? That's a much more tractable problem that we can understand the biology. I mean, you can build a computer to have a structure of demonstrating behaviorally a sense of self. Ultimately, you don't know whether there is an experience of a sense of self, because that's the phenomenal consciousness, but you can understand the machinery and the behavior that goes along with having a sense of self. And so that's another aspect of consciousness. Okay. Another aspect of consciousness is access consciousness. You weren't thinking about access.
Access, okay.
Like, okay, so you weren't thinking of unicorns 5 seconds ago, but you are now simply because I mentioned that. You had some representation of what a unicorn is somewhere in your brain, but you pulled it out and now you're thinking of it. You've accessed it.
And where did this thought in your brain come from? Did you come up with it, or did it just enter in and come out?
Yeah, now we're getting into free will. Why the unicorn versus the tooth fairy versus your grandmother? I've sometimes said in those examples, you're not thinking of your grandmother now, so I don't know. Okay. It seems to be random. It just popped into my head. But now you're going to ask me about free will, right? You're giving me all the softballs, exactly. James. Come on. I don't know.
By the end of this interview, we will have solved mental health, figured out what consciousness is, and final question for you: what the heck is going on with UFOs?
I love it, man. You got me on the ropes. You're giving me the tough ones. So yeah, we the other night had a brief discussion at a reception about this, and I said I'm intrigued by the evidence, and just like in my professional scientific realm, I want to be a radical empiricist.
Could you perhaps just quickly lay out bullet points? What is the evidence that you're intrigued by?
These various. Well, let me first get to my conclusion is I don't know, but I would say it's more likely than not that there's some type of extraterrestrial reality
Okay.
to the
And
visitor.
they're here.
I don't know that.
Right.
Yeah. I would say that's a very plausible explanation and might be more likely than not based on the evidence. The sightings by various instruments, obviously the Nimitz encounter, multiple trained observers from radically different perspectives with infrared and straight up video and radar and then the various encounters over the decades seemingly tied to nuclear sites of one type, which is really intriguing if you were to start to ask questions like, if there was a reality of this, what would they be interested in? Why would they? And the focus on this technology that could realistically, end our species. That's kind of interesting if that were somehow a focus. Like, if we fast forward ourselves millions of years, and if we discovered another civilization, what we would be interested in? Are they going to blow themselves up? I mean, this has been written about for decades. About if there is life, intelligent life in the universe, you have to pass all of these steps. You had to be on the right type of planet, and you had to get past that point in your evolution where you develop technologies, bioweapons, nuclear weapons that can destroy your entire species. And do you make it past that? And we don't know whether we're going to make it past that.
What's that paradox called? We have to get past the. I'm blanking on it. Oh well. Doesn't matter.
Yeah, I think I know what you're talking about. I'm blanking on it too. Why are they?
What is the point
probability
that we have to pass to reach the stars, essentially?
Right.
Anyhow, we're getting a little bit off topic. Whereas UFOs is totally on topic for a psychedelic conference, of course. But so I guess, are you good for time? I guess we can wrap this up if you want.
Yeah, I mean a couple minutes, but
Alrighty, so closing thoughts. Where do you think, bringing it back to psychedelics? We did UFOs, we did consciousness. Where do you think psychedelics are going in the next 5 years?
Oh gosh, I think within the next 5 years, we're probably going to see the approval of both MDMA and psilocybin for MDMA for PTSD, psilocybin for depression, probably Probably also within the next 5 years, I would say smoking cessation and alcohol use disorder within the next 5 years. I think probably approval. This all depends on the data. I'm not getting ahead of the data. But those were where my bets would be at. But that's just going to be the beginning. Because there's dozens of the disorders.
Society? Let's fast forward 30 years and let's give ourselves an optimistic outlook and say psychedelics are now widespread. You can use them recreationally, perhaps, or at least some of them. Do you think that would transform society, and if so, in which ways?
Well, the scientist in me makes me answer, well, by definition, that's going to be transformation because something will be different. How big is that transformation going to be? What are the ripple effects? Is it going to make human beings, kinder and gentler on average and make war less likely? I don't know. There is very good reason to speculate, I would say, that it's not going to be a universal. I see much more of a valence, like neutral aspect to psychedelics that we have a lot to figure out here, but they can be neutral. They can be pushed towards the negative. They don't necessarily lend themselves to pro-social. We talked about the CIA earlier. Charlie Manson used them to brainwash
people. Were like
people.
A death cult at times.
Yes, that human sacrifice. They used psychedelics in the context of. So, I think we got to be very careful. On average, what it's going to look like, certainly in the therapeutic context, I think it's pretty clear. And if we keep doing things right, there are more pro-social benefits. People seem to be, based on the evidence, kinder and gentler, and more appreciative of art, and the personality openness finding that we had. People more tolerant of other people's points of views. Those are going to be a good thing to the degree to which this is a ripple effect from this treatment. I think we've got to be careful of not thinking that psychedelics are going to automatically, they're not going to transform society into a utopia. I do think that, we are in that period where in the next 100, 200,000, whatever it is, maybe next decade, we're in that period where we're going to...
Somewhere between 10 years and 1,000 years.
Yeah, but in evolutionary time, it's basically now.
Right.
Like in terms of our evolution as a species, we're either going to snuff ourselves out or we're going to make it into the stars and colonize planets in the coming centuries. And that's going to be determined essentially now in terms of whether it's 500 years or 5 years from now. Will psychedelics play a role in helping us through that? I hope so, but I also want to say a lot of other things will. Appreciating mental health across the board, healthcare for human beings across the board, access to water across the board. All of these things are a huge part. It's not just psychedelics, not destroying our planet. It's not just psychedelics. Can psychedelics be a part of that, added into the mix? I think so. But yeah, it's not the only thing. And I always think of this where like, sometimes people, I don't know, they get a little too into it and say, oh, this is the highest level of work and whatnot. And you got to check yourself. Man, there's people that have given up everything to be, helping dying kids of malaria in Africa and whatnot. It's like, okay, there's a lot of good that's happening in this world. There's a lot of people pushing it, the pedal to the metal, to benefit our species. Mm-hmm. And yes, psychedelics, they're a part of that, but not the only thing.
And I think that's a great place to end it, on a note of hope. Hopefully by the next time we'll be talking, we'll both be doing psychedelics on Mars. Solve the hard problem of consciousness and chilling with the UFO aliens. Everybody, Matthew Johnson, thank you so much for being here.
Thanks, James. Appreciate it, dude.
Perfect.